I think we're ready to start. Welcome, everybody. My name is Claire Finkelstein, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. And welcome to the Annenberg Public Policy Center. I'm really delighted to see everyone here today for a very exciting conversation. I'd like to begin by thanking Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, for making this panel even more exciting than I expected it to be, along with the rest of the Trump administration. The timing was exquisite. For those of you who have followed CERL's work for a while, you know that we're a little bit famous for our spooky timing. The first conference that we ever held was on targeted killings, and it was many years ago. That was in 2012. No, that was not a common term in those days. It was, it was not a household term, so nobody knew exactly what it meant. But it became a household term about 2 weeks later when Osama bin Laden was killed. And then we produced our first volume in the series, in the Oxford series in Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law, on targeted killings, in which we discussed that strike along with many others. And then it became a very complex, difficult, and fascinating rule of law and national security issue that we tracked for many, many years. We had another similar issue when we had planned an event with the second in command, Chris Inglis of the NSA, and we had planned this event about 1.5 years in advance. And as it happens, the ACLU had sued the NSA, come up to the event 1.5 years later after initial planning, and it turned out that the morning of the conference was the exact date on which the ACLU was arguing its case against the NSA on the 214 metadata program in the Southern District in New York, and they excused themselves and said, we're going to be a little bit late because we have to appear in court. Well, they arrived, and the folks from the NSA arrived, and we proceeded to spend the next 1.5 days talking about the case. And both parties said, if the conference had happened just a little bit earlier, we might have actually avoided the lawsuit. So when these events happened 2 days ago with the Signals app communications breach, I thought, wow, isn't that interesting timing? This does keep happening. Because originally this panel was planned as a celebration of this volume, which came out a number of months ago and of course was many years in the planning. This volume that came out in our series with Oxford University Press, the series in the Oxford series in Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law. And we have Jen Henriksen here, who was one of the editors of this volume, reflects the proceedings of a conference that we held here a number of years ago. Was it 2018? To talk about the hard problems that arise at the intersection of national security and journalism. And two of the individuals here, Jen and David Boardman, were here for that original conference. And we thought this is such an important topic, and really with all of the writings and all of the discussions about journalism and freedom of the press and the complexities that we deal with, we really don't focus enough on the subset of that, which is the intersection of national security reporting, as well as the broader national security ramifications of the landscape for reporters across the board. And so we decided to celebrate this volume, which is a marvelous volume, and we encourage everybody to purchase the volume, and planned this event a long time in advance. And then, as I say, the administration handed us this wonderful gift of giving us a lens through which to talk about a lot of these issues, which is the Signals app, compromised communications that occurred a couple days ago. And so we're gonna talk about that, and we've assembled a wonderful panel to discuss that for you today. So let me introduce our panel, and then I'm gonna sit over there and play the role of moderator. And I'm really delighted that everybody could scramble around and get together on such short notice. And I'm gonna give very brief introductions here, so you can stop listening to me and listen to the participants. So first, Jen Henriksen is an assistant professor at the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University and senior personnel with the Viceroy Northwest Institute for Cybersecurity Education and Research. She's an affiliated fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project and an affiliated fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Media, Inequality, and Change Center. And then, of course, she is an editor of this volume, as well as holds a PhD from the Annenberg School for Communication from Penn. So thank you for joining us, Jen. And then I have my introductions here out of order, so I apologize for that. We have Catherine Eben, an investigative journalist, is a Vanity Fair special correspondent, best-selling author, and Andrew Carnegie Fellow. Her reporting on pharmaceutical fraud, gun trafficking, coercive CIA interrogations, COVID-19 origins, and the US bird flu outbreak have won international attention and numerous awards, including from the National Association of Science Writers, the Overseas Press Club, Investigative Reporters and Editors, the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and most recently, the George Polk Award for National Reporting. Her 2019 book, Bottle of Lies, The Inside Story of the Generic Drug Boom, was a New York Times bestseller. A Rhodes Scholar, educated at Brown and Oxford University, she lives in New York with her husband, 2 daughters, and Newfoundland dog, Aslan. And I'm gonna again skip to the end and then come back to our 2 panelists in the middle. Dean David Boardman. Dean Boardman is Dean of the Klein College of Media and Communication at Temple University in Philadelphia. Previously, Dean Boardman was executive editor and senior vice president of the Seattle Times, the largest news organization in the Pacific Northwest. Under his leadership, the Times won 4 Pulitzer Prizes and produced 10 Pulitzer finalists. Dean Boardman personally has been the recipient of numerous other major national awards, including the National Ethics Award from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Goldsmith Prize in Investigative Reporting from Harvard University, the Worth Bingham Prize in Investigative Reporting, the Investigative Reporters and Editors Award, and the Associated Press Managing Editors Public Service Award. Then, skipping back, we have Josh Gerstein. Josh Gerstein is Politico's senior legal affairs reporter. He covers the intersection of law and politics, including special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation of President Donald Trump and his associates, as well as ensuring counter investigations into the origins of the FBI's initial inquiry into the Trump-Russia saga. Although he is not a lawyer, he has spent more time in courtrooms and more time reading legal pleadings than many members of the bar. For more than a decade, Josh has taken Politico readers inside the most celebrated political trials of our era, including figures like former Senator John Edwards, former White House counsel Greg Craig, longtime Trump confidant Roger Stone, and former Trump campaign manager Paul Manafort. He served as a contributor to MSNBC for several of those trials In addition, his reporting and legal analysis has been featured in outlets such as National Public Radio, CNN, Fox News, Al Jazeera, the New York Times, and the New Republic. And last but not least, Frank Figliuzzi. Okay. Frank Figliuzzi is an American former law enforcement agent and author who served as Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was previously the Special Agent in charge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Cleveland Division, which includes all of northern Ohio, and the major cities of Cleveland, Toledo, Youngstown, Akron, and Canton. Following his FBI service, Frank joined General Electric and served for 5 years as Assistant Chief Security Officer for Investigations, Insider Threat, Workplace Violence Prevention, and Special Event Security for GE's 300,000 employees in 180 countries. He is a Senior National Security and Intelligence Analyst for NBC and MSNBC News, and you probably have heard him many, many times on MSNBC. That is, in fact, how I first got to know him, because I was watching him on MSNBC, and I said, we got to get this guy in here. And he has now been to CERL several times. He's also written 2 absolutely marvelous books, and he was here, The FBI Way, for his book talk on the FBI. So please join me in thanking our panelists and welcoming them for this. All right, so we're going to start by talking about this extraordinary breach that occurred and that we learned about just 2 days ago. And for those who think everybody knows what happened, but just to sort of recap the facts, we had very senior members of the Trump administration who somehow, and we still don't know how it happened, one of them managed to accidentally let in a reporter, the senior editor of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, into a Signals app, an encrypted messaging app chain, included him in their communications. Goldberg at first thought maybe it was a joke. What is this? How do we know if this is real? He waited for a while to see if it was real. Waited in a parking lot, watching their communications. And finally, when the bombing in Yemen that he was following on the Signals app chain said, they were talking about what they were planning to do in Yemen. They were planning to bomb the Houthi rebels, actually started to occur as they had forecasted. He realized, oh my goodness, they have just chatted, exposed me on their chat to classified war plans, telling me what they were planning to do in Yemen. And they are having these communications on an unsecured, not suitable for classified communications, common messaging app. He then took himself off the chat and only reported on this once the events in Yemen were through. Many people are saying that Jeffrey Goldberg was the only member of that chat who's really suited to handle classified information, handle things very responsibly. And now we have a panel here comprised of reporters and national security experts in handling classified information. And so we're going to talk about this and talk about all the really extraordinary aspects of this. And I actually want to start with Frank on this first so that we get the security landscape. And Frank, can you tell us what normal communications would be like around highly classified information involving war plans such as these?
Can I start by saying I do not recall? which is what the CIA director said on the Hill probably 7 times. So on a normal planet, which we apparently no longer live on. Here's, through my experience, what would happen. And my experience includes serving as the head of counterintelligence for the FBI, which meant, much to the bane of my existence, that in my spare time, I also led all leak investigations. What should happen here, at the very least, is the opening of an investigation, and it is called a leak investigation. And actually, further, there's a for those who are into administrivia, there's a category called media leak investigations. That's what would be opened on a preliminary basis. When you're working at this level of subject, who was on the call? The CIA director, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, the DNI. It's not something I would certainly open on my own, but I would walk up to the 7th floor of the Hoover Building in Washington, talk to the deputy director or director. For those of you who may not be having to keep up because you have a healthy lifestyle, the deputy director is now Dan Bongino, a far-right extremist conspiracy theorist podcaster, and the director, of course, is a Trump loyalist named Kash Patel. Why is that significant? Because it's not like walking up and talking to Bob Mueller or Louis Freeh or any other former director. And I would say, sir, here are the facts we have. Typically, we would lead this. We'd open a case. I think we need to go to DOJ because of the level of these people, and we need to get their concurrence to open this. And we would get briefed around the community very tightly. We would get briefed to the DNI. Because it involves DOD information, I'd probably find myself at the Pentagon briefing the fact simply that we opened a case, and I would be briefing to the House and Senate Intelligence Committee chairs. That's how that would work at this level. Certainly not for a lower level employee, which happens regularly, who mistakenly lets things out. But that's how it should go. My concerns here are a couple of things that cause us to think this isn't going to happen. First, you've got the principals on this call, really the people that I would ordinarily brief that, hey, we've opened a leak case, are of course people who should be recusing themselves from this because they were part of not noticing who was on the call. They were part of not following how classified material should be discussed, not on signal, despite the claim of the CIA director repeatedly on the Hill that this is all approved. It's all good. Signals approved by the CIA for such discussions, and by the way, none of this was classified. That's the mantra we've heard from these folks. So do I think there's going to be an inquiry? What we've heard, and please step in, is the National Security Advisor, who was on the call, is going to task someone at the National Security Council, which he supports, to do this inquiry. And then we've heard more recently that maybe the DOD Inspector General, who I didn't think existed anymore, I thought they were all fired, whoever that is, might actually launch an inquiry. That's wrong. Again, based on normal plan, it should be an FBI investigation.
So let me just get clear about this. Is it at all normal for members of an administration to be texting on a common messaging app with regard to this kind of highly classified information?
So for those of you who may not be familiar with Signal, it's a commercially available app. You can download it even as I speak. Go to the App Store, download Signal, and you'll have it in 30 seconds. And it's end-to-end encrypted. It's pretty good encryption. But ironically, there are rules about Signal. And yes, I've read about what the CIA director was talking about. Hey, this is approved. It did not say it's approved for classified. The tone of that document was really, you can use things like Signal, but the reference was sensitive discussion. If you're in a pinch, kind of a thing. There are ways to do this, and if we assume for a moment that this was indeed classified information, government systems should have been used, and government systems are in place. Are they sometimes cumbersome? They have been in the past, but we're getting to the point where they're not cumbersome now, and they're portable.
And that means a different cell phone, right? Not the one you're using every day. That means a different cell phone.
Yeah, a government device. iPad.
Government device.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
I mean,
not going to be Signal.
Yeah.
Now, Josh, you and I talked about this last night. There was a memo from the Pentagon in 2023 warning about the use of commercial apps, just like this, in fact, but that memo warned about the risks of using commercial apps even for unclassified information. Can you tell us a little bit the background of that and why the Pentagon might have sent such a memo?
Well, we've seen these memos from several agencies. I think one just came out last month from the National Security Agency telling their people who, as Frank says, are not supposed to use Signal for classified information, but sometimes may use it for, I think what the word they used maybe was administrative things like we're all meeting at this time in this room or something like that. If somebody's outside the building, they may need to know that. You're not supposed to say we're all meeting about the attack we're going to do on Yemen tonight, right? Because of what you mentioned with the personal phone, the end-to-end encryption means it's highly unlikely somebody can crack the messages in transit. But if somehow someone got access to your phone, either directly or, certainly state actors have the ability to implant things on your phone, they can read everything on your phone, including Signal and any other app that you might be on there. So to say it's encrypted is sort of better than it being not encrypted or a regular text message, but it's in no way a guarantee that that information is secure. So that's why these warnings have been given out. And what was interesting about the NSA warning that I saw was it was warning about a use of Signal, which sounds almost very similar to what happened here. Like, we don't know exactly how Jeffrey Goldberg got added to the chat, but the warning was being given that if somebody sent you a link that you didn't recognize and you clicked on it, you could accidentally include someone in a Signal group or some other kind of group you have on your phone, and they would then have access to the messages. I mean, obviously that's another potential way this can be breached. You would hope on a government system that someone not in the government or random walking down the street could not be added due to various safeguards. But here, there's obviously next to no safeguards, and anybody who was organizing that group or had access to Mike Waltz's phone could add any other person in the world to the group, which makes it not secure by definition. They're lucky in a sense that it was Jeff Goldberg, as he has pointed out, and not some other journalistic or non-journalistic actor that could have done who knows what with the information.
And just one more question to you about this, because there was a memo sent out from the Pentagon under Secretary of Defense just 3 days before this revelation. And that memo said, we are concerned about leaks of classified information. We're going to be conducting an investigation that will report to the Secretary of Defense. We're going to be using polygraphs to conduct investigations because of all the leaks. Now, I mean, this is like some scene from Casablanca where the French police officer shuts down Humphrey Bogart's gambling house, casino, and then somebody comes up and says, "You're winning, sir," right? And hands him his gambling winnings. I mean, the hypocrisy is absolutely extraordinary.
Right.
What are we to make of this? Are they going to be conducting polygraph tests on the Secretary of Defense?
Well, it seems unlikely to me, but if it does escalate to an FBI investigation, maybe in fact they will. But we've seen the administration just in this second Trump term launch a series of public efforts to get at leakers. There have been complaints about that allegedly FBI agents were leaking advance information about their involvement now in immigration raids that are taking place. The complaints at the FBI that there were leaks coming about, the sandwiches the director was ordering or something from his office, things along those lines about his personality and things like that. And so we've seen a series of different threatened leak investigations just in the, seems like a year, but it was what has been basically 2 months of the Trump administration. And so to then say we're not going to do a serious criminal investigation of what happened here with the classified information and hand it over to the White House counsel's office, the NSC, and apparently Elon Musk to investigate just doesn't sound like any prior investigation like this that I'm familiar with ever being conducted.
So yeah, they may be investigating their own leadership, right? That may be the issue. Catherine, you've handled a lot of sensitive material from your sources, from some government sources as well. How does a responsible journalist handle highly sensitive material? And do you think Jeffrey Goldberg did a good job here?
So I think that he did an extraordinary job, actually. I mean, his first article really clearly laid out the decision-making that the Atlantic went through in deciding what to print and what not to print. You know, they understood that they had been the recipients of classified materials. They decided that they were going to omit the portions of the signal chats they've been exposed to accidentally that clearly contained classified information. So, you know, sequence of attacks, that kind of information. They chose to withhold the name of an active CIA agent, even though Ratcliffe, the CIA director, put that name in the chat, and they clearly laid out the rationale for doing all of that. What's really interesting is that, you know, then the fallout, the following day, you had all of these Trump administration officials coming out and saying, oh, no, it wasn't classified information, right? So that's kind of like waving a red cape in front of a bull. You know, what was the Atlantic going to do faced with those claims? Now, the administration essentially boxed themselves into a corner, right? Oh, it's not classified. Okay, so then I'm okay to publish it. The Atlantic even then went back to all of those officials asking them, how would you feel, since this is not classified, how would you feel about us publishing the transcripts? And, you know, they didn't get a lot of answers back, but the answers they got back were essentially supportive of the idea that this wasn't classified, which is not true. But then the White House communications operation gave them an answer back saying, well, it's not classified, but we'd still prefer if you not print it. At that point, the Atlantic is like, here you go. We're printing the transcripts, you know? And those transcripts clearly revealed that the Trump administration officials were lying. So I think, you know, journalistically, you know, they did just about as well as you possibly could have, including, you know, everybody was asking, so has Mike Walls been talking to Jeffrey Goldberg? Was he a source? And, you know,
Why was his number in his contacts? Or what Jeffrey somebody was he trying to add, or somebody Goldberg was he trying to add to that chat?
Right, so when Jeffrey Goldberg, you know, Mike Waltz came out and said, don't know the guy, never talked to the guy, even though now today there have been pictures of the two of them at a conference together. And, you know, when Jeffrey Goldberg was asked, you know, do you know Mike Waltz? Have you talked to Waltz? His answer was, I'm going to decline to comment on that, which speaks volumes.
So David, you've been mentioning to me that when I commented about the attacks on Jeffrey Goldberg, which is really the MO of this administration, right? Somebody exposes your wrongdoing and they turn on the somebody who exposed them, right? To impugn their character, even though it wasn't actually an intent, they really exposed themselves. Jeffrey Goldberg was sort of the incidental conduit for this exposure. Then, of course, the attacks came in on Goldberg to say the so-called journalist, and right. But you've pointed out there were other attacks as well.
Yeah. First of all, I want to say if Pete Hegseth is getting a lie detector test, I'm taking the over for sure. Yeah. I mean, first of all, the reaction of the White House in particular in attacking him is just so incredibly outrageous. and their portrayal of him, of this as a hoax, of him as a, quote, so-called journalist. Pete Hegseth characterization of Goldberg as a so-called journalist. So I weighed in, as I do in my role as a dean of a communication and journalism school, and weighed in supporting how Goldberg had conducted this and said this could actually be a journalism class on how to handle sensitive material in an ethical and careful way. And of course, I then got blasted on X, as happens. But what really surprised me is I got at least as much criticism from people on the left as people on the right. And the far left particularly, but people who felt that Goldberg should just have outed with it the minute he got it, even before the attacks. And that somehow he is protecting the administration, and some commentary, and there hasn't been a lot on this, but I don't think it's necessarily irrelevant, pointing out that Jeffrey Goldberg once was a member of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and there are aspects of this that I don't want to fuel conspiracy theories,
Right.
but that do make you scratch your head and say, why him, why then? And I personally do believe it was an accidental thing, where I think Waltz was talking to Goldberg and was a source, but there's just enough there to fuel the conspiracy theorists on lots of other possibilities.
And everything fuels conspiracy theories, and we're going to talk about the responsibility of journalists to be aware that their stories may have that effect. But Jennifer, just before we get to that, I want to ask you, because you've made some remarks about the discomfort that many journalists have in using encrypted applications and technologies, and the complications as well of journalists relating to social media platforms. So I wonder, what are your thoughts about that? And should journalists really be staying away from these social messaging apps?
Yes, it's a great question. And I also just want to say that with Jeffrey Goldberg taking so much caution, it's really indicative of how journalists are attacked in general these days.
Yeah.
So he was so hesitant to believe that this was authentic, because journalists are often targeted with disinformation campaigns. They're targeted with phishing attacks through email or social media to try to get access to a journalist's account, to try to get access to a journalist's device, to implicate their sources, their communications, and damage their credibility. And so in some of my research, what I've seen is not necessarily specifically in the NatSec sector, but more generally, journalists have had a difficult time engaging with encrypted technologies. A long time ago, we talked about PGP email and how that was super important for journalists to communicate with one another or with sources in an encrypted fashion, but it's very clunky, right? It was very difficult for even a really committed journalist to use that in the newsroom and then teach others about it. Nowadays, we do have Signal, so more journalists are utilizing that technology, in part because it's so easy to use. And like we talked about, it's end-to-end encrypted, which does mean that communications in transit are protected. But what we sort of alluded to, but we didn't get into in depth, is that the device that you are using is very vulnerable. And so the fact that these principals were using, personal or even government phones with Signal on them doesn't mean that those devices weren't compromised in some way and that their conversations were accessed. Because if you gain access to the device, it's not encrypted anymore. You can see it in plain text. And so it's just something that in my role as an educator, I'm trying to make sure that journalists are more aware of different security applications. But then I also learned that in some sectors of government, even now having Signal on your phone is sort of a cause of concern, right? That you might be, as a government official, someone who is leaking to the media. And what does that mean for an educator who's telling journalists, if you want to have protected communications, use Signal, do these other, download different applications, use encryption in different ways, right? There's lots of different aspects that journalists can engage in. But Signal was really popular because it's so easy to use. And more people, especially in the 2016 election, used it. There was a rapid spike of downloads of Signal. And so all of a sudden, it didn't make you stand out to use it. Sources were already doing so.
Yeah, exactly. So the messaging platforms themselves are not secure. Even if you have secure technology, it's only as secure as your phone is. And Frank, there's reporting that Steve Witkoff himself, the special envoy, Trump administration special envoy, was actually standing in Moscow while he was messaging in this chain. So he could have had the most secure technology in the world. And there could have been, a Putin agent looking over his shoulder, right?
Well, the people on this call are the most highly targeted officials in our government, by far. They're the targets, and that means they are bombarded constantly at their home, in their vehicles, at their office, without getting into classified information. There are teams of foreign adversarial intelligence officers, technical specialists who are in Washington, standing on street corners, trying to intercept, the corner office at FBI headquarters, the Pentagon, et cetera. And there's very sophisticated methods to do that. So you're supposed to keep that all in mind. And if you're in Moscow and you're noticing you're having what clearly is a classified conversation, this is my opinion, but the opinion of many others, that it was indeed classified, and you realize I'm on signal and I'm in Moscow, you got to get off that call. The way to do it would have been to go to the U.S. Embassy Moscow, get in the skiff, and say, guys, gals, we're going to go to a secure video conference, or we're going to, let everybody get on your secure phones, which, by the way, these folks have at home. They have in their car. Their homes are swept regularly for technical compromise, as is the car. These are people who drive to work in the morning. Remember, if you think this sounds strange, the whole signal thing, yes, because when they come out of their front door at home in the morning and get into their limo, they're handed the morning brief. The morning brief is on a hardened government encrypted device. So they can't pretend, oh, I didn't know we have encrypted devices. No, you do, because you get handed one every morning.
Okay, so they come into office, they're neophytes, they haven't been around that long maybe, but they come into office, they get a training, right? They get a briefing. They're professionals, if they haven't been fired yet, they're professionals who are briefing them on how to handle classified information, who are helping them all along the way. So Josh, how does something like this happen? Are they ignoring the risks? Are they deliberately flouting them? Do they not care? What's going on here?
Well, I mean, I suspect that the main thing that's going on here is hypocrisy. I mean, coming from Politico, I think I need to sort of lay the baseline that we have to go back to the 2016 campaign and the role that Hillary Clinton's emails played in that campaign, and the role that, Trump, to great effect, campaigned on the fact that she had been cavalier in her handling of what was at a minimum sensitive information, and which the FBI later determined to be classified. And so it's probably too much to say it's like the raison d'etre of the Trump 2016 campaign, but it was a big, big theme. And so to then have officials that you can find clips that were airing last night all over cable television of earlier comments they had made about how important it was, Marco Rubio talking about how important it is to handle sensitive information in a responsible way, and how crazy it was to have that kind of information on a private account or a private server. I don't know whether they didn't care about it at the time and they were simply lying, they've changed their opinion for some reason, or like a lot of people, when it comes to a trade-off between handling information responsibly and their personal convenience, they will opt for personal convenience. There also was like a weirdly celebratory atmosphere to the chat. So I don't know if there's some sort of like group peer pressure, and as some people have pointed out, you had grown men entering emojis onto the chat after whatever had gone on.
Right.
So there's just a weird kind of locker room high five atmosphere to it. And I will say that I do think that there are areas where the technology can be inconvenient for people. I remember, even if you go back to the Clinton episode, one of the reasons people would give is that there are sometimes exigencies, as I think Frank mentioned. Government secured technology is not perfect. especially the mobile forms of it. And there are situations where people are in foreign countries and they need to find out the answer to something in the next half hour, and the answer that my secure line or phone is down is just not a good enough answer. And sometimes the senior officials do have the authority to say, we're going to use another system. It's just not clear that there was any emergency or exigency or anything about this. You know, the fact that Goldberg was sitting in a Safeway parking lot, the other people seem to have been sitting at their homes, or God knows where they were if they were not in Russia. I think Tulsi Gabbard also said yesterday she was overseas somewhere. So at least two of the participants were outside the country when this was taking place. So, you know, I think there's some reason to try to want to make those systems more efficient, but this was an exceedingly bad way to try to create that efficiency.
And Jennifer has
I just want to add, yeah, this is so crazy to me. Also, I would just say that skips you have travel skips with you, right? When you go different places. So the argument that it wasn't convenient, I think is, I mean, outrageous to me. And I think a big part of this is arrogance. There was a suggestion, probably implicit, that they would not be caught doing this, right? And yet they were, because they inadvertently added a reporter onto the group chat. And so I just think that you can't even argue that it was too time sensitive, because in the chat, if you follow it, they talk about how maybe this isn't the right time to launch the missiles on the Houthi rebels, right? Is it time sensitive? I don't know. Let's think about the economics of it, right? So even like implicit in the conversation, it's not time sensitive. So I think it's more about arrogance and the fact that they didn't think that they would be caught.
Can you real quick on this topic of kind of trying to get inside their head on this, right? Yes, arrogance, for sure. Rules don't apply to us, for sure. But in addition, there's this Trumpian mindset that we don't trust the deep state civilians in government. We simply don't. And so we don't want our deliberations and discussions to be part of any public record. In fact, the lawsuit that's just recently been filed by an organization, whose name escapes me.
American Oversight.
Thank you, has filed a lawsuit on this issue. What's the crux of that lawsuit? You did this conversation in a way that can't become a matter of official record, can't be archived. What are you doing? And I think that's deliberate. I think it is.
Right. They set it to disappearing, right?
I mean,
Partway through.
that is really, I think, to me, the central issue is that they are clearly routinely using Signal to evade freedom of information discovery and, you know, requests. And nobody, and it seems evident that they routinely are doing this because nobody of the 18 people on that, nobody said, maybe we shouldn't be doing this on Signal, right? They all.
Well, and on top of it, Hegseth actually said, we're clear on security.
We're clear on OPSEC.
OPSEC, right.
We're 100% on OPSEC.
Right.
You know, but and the other point that I would make, now Witkoff denied, he, you know, fulminated on X that he had left his personal devices at home. So he definitely wasn't on them and he wasn't using them in the Kremlin, he claimed. But people were like, you know, he just glowingly brought back this portrait that Putin had given him of Donald Trump. And people are like, did you check the portrait?
Yeah.
What kind of listening devices are in there?
So let's pivot to another topic. So as we were just saying, there were these attacks on Jeffrey Goldberg as the sort of MO, when you've made a mistake, attack the person who's exposed your mistake. But in fairness, this is not the first administration to attack journalists. And so I want to take a wider lens on this. And let's go back to the Obama administration, where journalists were under constant threat of prosecution under the Espionage Act. And David, I'm going to ask you a little bit to talk about that and what the situation was like for journalists. And we're talking, you know, let's remember, under a Democratic administration that we think of as very committed to freedom of the press and so on. But here there were this sort of Damocles hanging over many journalists for quite a long time. I was just in an email exchange with Jim Risen the other day, who lived with us for a long time. And
yeah, I mean, his was the most high profile of the cases under that. You know, people it's surprising to many people, particularly as we look back at history. There were some serious shifts in the Obama administration around dealings with the press relative to traditional norms during preceding that. One was absolutely the seizing of reporter phone records. One was as simple as total restriction on photographic access to the White House. And in fact, almost every photograph that the public had access to was taken by Pete Souza, the official White House photographer. So it really began there. But then in the second term of the Obama administration, we meaning the press and press advocacy groups, really made some progress in terms of Department of Justice guidelines around what would be, how to protect reporter rights, how to provide significant and called for and constitutional access. Then we backslid during the first Trump administration. There were at least 8 cases there of reporter phone records being seized. Then Biden, back to the DOJ guidelines, and in fact even I think more loose and liberal than we saw under Obama. And now, we are where we are, and I think it's inevitable, and we were talking before the panel, I think we all feel it's inevitable that this administration is going to go after not only records of journalists, but very likely arrest American journalists at some point for some alleged violation of national security. And at that point, I think, and I think it's the essence of this discussion ultimately, which is, what are we securing? Are we securing the rights of the public, the First Amendment rights of access and the public's right to know and of journalists, or are we protecting a different sort of deep state that we're seeing emerge right now?
Right. So one of the things that's very concerning is that this administration has talked about getting rid of the landmark First Amendment decision, New York Times v. Sullivan. Donald Trump has made no bones about the fact that, despite the fact that they talk about wanting to restore the First Amendment, sometimes on the one hand, they're actually attacking it on the other. And so they've said that they actually want to see New York Times v. Sullivan overturned. And that obviously would be a nuclear bomb on this whole area that we're talking about. I guess I'm the only lawyer on the panel, so I have to ask myself, what is the likelihood of this happening? But actually, Josh, maybe you have some thoughts about that.
I mean, as a non-lawyer, but someone who does cover the Supreme Court.
Yes, exactly.
We've had 2 justices come out so far, Justice Clarence Thomas and Justice Neil Gorsuch, and say, not quite that New York Times versus Sullivan, which, if people don't know, that's the actual malice standard. If you're reporting on a public official or a public figure, it makes it very hard, basically, for those people to win a libel suit against a news organization or a journalist, unless you can really prove that the journalist knew what they were publishing was false or was just completely reckless in their conduct where they should have known that it was false or likely false. That's been the law in the United States now for, what, about 60 years, something like that. And so, but we have had just in the last 3 or 4 years, Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch come out and say they think that should be revisited, maybe not for public officials, but maybe for public figures at a minimum. You've had Trump repeatedly say that the libel laws in the country need to be overturned. You had a close Trump ally, Steve Wynn, the casino magnate, try to use a libel suit he has against the Associated Press to get the Supreme Court to take up this issue, and just fail. As recently as this past Monday, the Supreme Court declined to take that case up. It looks for the moment like the center left is holding on the court, and that even some or most of the Trump appointees subscribe to sort of an old school First Amendment view that incorporates New York Times versus Sullivan, and there are not even enough votes at the moment to take a case. That would take 4 of the 9 votes on the court to take the case, and it looks like they're short 1 or 2 votes of being able to do that. But we have seen from some lower court judges who are conservative opinions where they describe New York Times versus Sullivan as judge-made law and say that the Supreme Court should go back and revisit it. And it's something we're watching closely in the lower courts among people that are talked about as potential Supreme Court nominees about what their views are on this. Do they have this sort of neo-Trumpian view that the First Amendment in the hands of journalists is going too far, or do they subscribe to the sort of older school view that has pretty maximal protections for the press?
Right, so I assume that if it got reversed, what we would get rid of is the actual malice standard, and we'd end up with more like a negligence standard, so that if you printed, if you were negligent even in printing incorrect information, you could be held liable by those who were maligned by that information.
And it would free the states to basically make their own, these laws are state laws, so there's a rule imposed by the federal constitutional, by the Supreme Court, but states don't have to have libel laws at all if they don't want to have them. So we would end up with a hodgepodge of different states with all kinds of different rules, and some of them would be extremely, hostile to the press, and others would probably be as protective, if not more protective, than the Supreme Court is right now. And
so in addition to potentially rolling back New York Times v. Sullivan, in addition to possible prosecution under the Espionage Act, another tool that could be used against journalists, and we're not trying to give a laundry list here to the administration of what can be used, but we are seeing increasingly is the Alien Enemies Act. And we're seeing that used, of course, with respect to students who are starting to be deported. We're seeing that with respect to suspected gang members. Is it possible that we could see that with respect to journalists? David, maybe you have some thoughts about that.
I think, it's possible, certainly. I think what we're seeing right now, actually, and I think is a more clear and present danger that we're already seeing, is the use of even current libel laws. The idea that the president would sue the Des Moines Register for a political poll that had him losing and he didn't lose, so he's going to sue. Or the pressure that's put, the libel suit we've seen on ABC and George Stephanopoulos, and to see them acquiesce in advance and roll over, the pressure that's coming on CBS and their apparent rollover because it appears that their principals want to make sure that a merger goes through. These are the sorts of pressures that I think are far more present right now, and that really concern me in terms of if and when journalists are prosecuted under whichever act, will their employers actually stand behind them and defend them as they have in the past?
Good, so this is a really critical issue. So we are starting to see news organizations, law firms, universities, a lot of organizations roll over and make deals with the Trump administration to try to save their skins. And as you're pointing out, David, we are not seeing other organizations of those types step up to defend the organizations that are under attack. And therefore, there is more incentive to capitulate under those circumstances. So with these attacks on various news organizations, we didn't see other news organizations rise to object to this treatment. So let's take the case of AP getting kicked out of the White House press briefings. Other organizations did not boycott those briefings as they could have. At the same time, we learned that Russian news organization RT was being allowed into the White House, right? So Catherine, do you have any thoughts about how media organizations should be responding to these sort of attacks on one another? What's the right response here?
I think that the right response is for the press.
Talk a little bit more into the mic.
The right response is for the press corps, and particularly the the White House press corps to unify, to unite, and basically boycott. You know, when certain press outlets were losing designated space inside the White House complex, when the AP, as you point out, was being isolated, you know, there should have been, or could have been, a universal boycott. The problem is, I think the Trump administration would say, who cares about the legacy media? All you guys are irrelevant, and we'll just get our podcasters and our, you know, social media stars in here, and they can just sit in on the White House briefings and forget about CBS News and forget about MSNBC. You know, I mean, that's the threat environment they're facing, is that I'm not sure that they would blink in the face of a mass departure of the legacy media.
See, I think they would, because there's nothing Trump hates more than to be ignored. And I think that would have been effective.
So then what do we do if they boycott, then RT is the only one covering?
No, you find other ways to cover it, right? I mean, you don't have to always be right there in the room. You need to have your sources outside of the room. You probably get better, you know, intelligence that way anyway.
Well, I mean, but this, you know, this brings you to the whole problem of how the press is covering this administration anyway, and whether they are kind of softening their coverage in exchange for access, which I believe I am seeing. You know, you are seeing, I mean, except for, you know, investigative outlets and investigative reporters, journalists who are depending on access are, I believe, softening their coverage.
Well, and Josh, was that always the case? That is, if you don't cover a president the way that administration wants to be covered, it's harder to get your hand, you know, you're raising your hand in those press briefings, it's harder to get called on, that's right?
Yeah, I do think that every administration has retaliated in some way, shape, or form, not to the degree that this current White House has done. We saw in previous administrations, you know, there was a showdown with Fox News, for example. It's also a little bit confusing for the media, I have to say, because if we go back to the first Trump administration, we were being told we shouldn't cover his briefings at all because what he's saying is dangerous. Now we're being told, you know, we have to be covering his briefings all the time. And, you know, journalists are sort of doing the best they can here, I think, in a difficult environment. It seems pretty obvious human nature that when you're interacting with people, if those people find you to be totally hostile to them, they're less likely to be cooperative with, like, giving you information. That doesn't mean, you know, as Jem was saying, that if somebody's being uncooperative with you, your story is done and you can't do that story. Most of us encounter that every single day, and then we just try to figure out, you know, how to route around the obstruction and get the information in another way. But, you know, it's a challenge to cover an administration like this, to say the least. And the other thing, you know, as Catherine was saying, there is an element of this where Trump is trying to get the media to fight with him. Right? So, you know, his view is that the media is hopelessly biased. And, you know, for him to demonstrate that, one way is to get the media in an uproar to attack him in some way, whatever it's for. It might be for kicking out the AP, it might be for other things. And then he says, well, look, now you know you threw a punch back. This just proves you guys are in the mud pit with us like everybody else. So I do think some of these things the administration does see it as a win-win. Like, you know, if there's no boycott, they win because they're terrorizing everybody. And if there's a boycott, they win because they can just, you know, declare the irrelevance of the mainstream media.
Frank, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just think looking at this through a different lens, through the lens of national security, federal law enforcement, I do think, and part of my job is to kind of, as an analyst, is to engage in some predictive analysis. I think there are warning signs and indicators that we're just seeing the very beginning of a threat to journalists. Because I do see clear signs and indicators that the power of the Justice Department, the power of federal law enforcement is going to be brought to bear against anything that's viewed as a perceived threat by the administration. just in the last 48 hours, and we were talking about this in the green room, I've seen reporting of two items, one bigger than the other, but one, and they both have incurred the wrath of the Trump administration. One is a news outlet in San Francisco, KCBS, apparently reported real-time, live, a raid by ICE and on a specific street, gave the address, here's where they are, it's active right now. Well, they're apoplectic at the White House over this. And and it's not clear to me, I think it's not clear to them, whether they're apoplectic over someone leaking this address for an ICE raid and claiming it's a deep state federal employee who's out to get us and, oh my God, we're going to conduct a major investigation, or is it KCBS that's going to really face the brunt of that? And by the way, this is happening all over the country. It's not a secret when your neighbor gets raided by ICE. The other item that I've seen reported in the last day or two is that the New York Times now has their hands on internal government research and conclusions that the violent gang trend, Venezuelan gang, Tren de Aragua, really has no connections to the Venezuelan government. Therefore, you really shouldn't be calling it an international terrorist organization. They're not invading us, and you got a problem here, Mr. President, with doing that. And again, they are livid over this. And number one, somebody leaked it. Number two, the New York Times has it. And I think all of this should concern journalists and should cause them to be extra vigilant in their conduct of their business, their travel. I envision, again, just envision, a day when journalists are returning from vacation or wherever overseas, they're coming through customs and they get tossed. They get put in secondary, things like that. Maybe they get a little extra IRS audit. But I see a proclivity to use the arm and power of government against perceived enemies.
And then once again, journalists who are not American citizens will be presumably targeted for the extra special treatment of those who are either green card holders or do not have regularized immigration status. We should also talk about media organizations that depend on federal funds, like Voice of America, that are just being wholly shut down. Now, this raises the whole issue, of course, of congressional appropriations and the obligation to respect congressional appropriations and to allow Congress to make decisions about how it's going to spend the power of the purse. And these things are being slowly challenged in the court system. Whether or not the administration is going to follow the dictates of court decisions, what courts are going to hold is another matter. But what do we think in the meanwhile about the status of press organizations that hold federal funds, and that being a way for the administration to exert extra control? It's rather extraordinary already the degree to which media organizations, and I'm thinking here of the Washington Post, which you expect to have been a counterweight to the administration, to stop making the extraordinary decision not to run op-eds that run counter to the administration, in effect. Then when you have media organizations that actually rely for their existence on federal funding being shut down, David.
Yeah, I can speak with some personal contact on this. So I'm on the board of an organization called the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project. It's an international organization started by an American journalist and a Romanian investigative journalist. Was central to the Panama Papers, which many of you are aware of, that won the Pulitzer Prize and revealed much about sheltered and washed money around the globe. They depend for about a third of their revenue, and it was far more than that at the beginning, but we've ratcheted that down over the years, but about a third of the budget came from USAID. Yeah. And initially, as a traditional American journalist, as I came onto the board at the beginning, I was really, it made me uncomfortable, frankly, any kind of government funding for journalism. But in pretty short order, I came to understand, number one, this was the only way you could really build an organization like this to be with any effectiveness. And number two, that the benefit of having American journalistic values and norms brought to parts of the world where this was entirely novel was so incredible. And to watch the journalism that was being done in Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Poland and places where speaking truth to power was just not at all part of their tradition, it was remarkable. And this is a network of literally hundreds of independent investigative organizations. 1/3 of the budget gone like that overnight.
There's a real national security piece to this, which is, whether we're talking about food going to third world countries through USAID, whether we're talking about the Voice of America being dismantled, rest assured that China and Russia and others will step in and fill that void. They will. And so, if Voice of America is gone or diminished, you'll see propaganda pouring into those countries from places like China. And they'll be happy to do it. And that's national security. Right. It really is. It's whether these countries now view America as an ally and friend or not, and whether we lose that ground to an adversary.
So we're going to get into questions in just a minute. I have one more area that I want to cover, though, which is we've been talking about threats to journalistic freedom and journalistic integrity from administrations. I want to talk about one more area of threat, which is journalists' own practices, and sometimes a kind of self-censorship that results in journalists not doing as free and fair and robust a job in reporting as they could, because there's a kind of herd mentality that may go along in journalistic reporting. And I think after the 2016 election, there was a lot of hand-wringing in journalistic communities about, did we cover this right? What did we do to sort of contribute to this result? And some people have said in the run-up to the 2020 election, there was sort of, in the 2024 election, there was sane washing of the president. And then there are other areas. And Catherine has a lot of experience covering the COVID origins debate, and where she's been sort of writing against the trends, and the trends have slowly been turning. So I wonder if you could say anything about, what do you do when you're bucking the journalistic community itself?
That is a great question. So I was one of the first mainstream media journalists to investigate the possibility that COVID originated from a laboratory accident in Wuhan, as opposed to a natural spillover.
Just talk a little bit more into the mic. It's
and
not
I did
amplifying
a big story on that in 2021. And I have stayed on that story since, and I have often stayed on it and have been subjected to incredible online attack. And my viewpoint all along has been that my allegiance has to be strictly, the only team I can be on is the team of the story and my media outlet. I cannot be on the team of accepted wisdom. I cannot be on the team of credentialed experts solely, even if those experts, even if some of them are my sources, but I really have to follow the story wherever it goes. And that can be an incredibly uncomfortable feeling. I mean, Trump, was one of the first people to say that it came from a lab. A broken clock can be right twice a day, but it can be an incredibly uncomfortable experience to face accusations that you are somehow empowering, people who are involved in very bad things, but who might be right nonetheless. So I think, as a journalist, your commitment has to be to follow the facts wherever they lead, regardless of how uncomfortable that is. But, one of the things that my editor and I did with all of the stories, and we've done now about 5 of these big stories on COVID origins, is to break down the ideological frame, each time, to recognize and give voice to the fact that this is, there are lunatic conspiracy theories about how COVID origins is a bioweapon and Fauci was in the back room of the WIB, and to acknowledge, we understand that's out there. We're not talking about that. We are talking about government funding for risky coronavirus research that was given to the WIB, and we're in the world of facts. We're in the world of contracts and memos and all of that. So I think when you're doing that, you have to be, very careful about your method for approaching the story, and really a proper journalistic method is what will ultimately save you from, I don't know if they'll stop the attacks, but they'll ensure your accuracy, and that's really
And
what
your
you have to
integrity.
do.
David,
Your
do you think
integrity.
that media organizations do enough to protect their journalists who are doggedly going after the truth and the facts from the sort of attacks that can come from people who don't like the reporting, even within the profession?
I think the good ones do still. And, I admire the reporting you did greatly there. And I also understand why there was blowback, because initially the news, so-called news sources that reported that theory at the time, and they reported it as fact, and they had no facts, were places like OAN, One America Network, and so it immediately took on an ideological flavor to it. But I do think, to answer your question, Claire, I mean, I like to believe that the New York Times and even the Washington Post now, and certainly Politico, would stand behind Josh, for what might be a politically unpopular story. But I do have, as I said earlier, great concerns about where we're headed.
I think Jennifer wants to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, so it's not only the good ones, it's also the well-resourced ones, right?
Yeah.
So journalists are in particular facing a lot of online harassment or mob censorship from the ground up, right? With individuals targeting them on social media platforms, trying to silence them, trying to limit their digital publicity and their ability to communicate their stories, and also reach out to sources and things like that. And what I found anyway in the security realm is that you might have a very well-meaning news organization, but if they think that finances are not there to help better protect their journalists by providing services like Delete Me to get their reporters' personal information offline, they're not going to be able to provide it. So there's also an education component where there needs to be more done within news organizations to better understand how there are cheaper ways, right, to protect journalists, in addition to the more sophisticated and financially problematic ways.
Security, just to echo that, good security is really expensive. And national media organizations are spending increasingly more money protecting their on-air talent. The threats, again, I spent 25 years in the FBI, I've seen threats. But what I'm seeing now is astounding against people just doing their job in the media, and a lot of money being spent to protect them.
And one of the topics we didn't get to, maybe we'll address it in the question session, is journalists overseas and their security, both in war zones, but in zones where they may be taken hostage. And, the efforts to free Wall Street Journal's Evan Gersovich, and the lengths that the Trump administration went to do that, would that have happened if he had been from a different media organization? Right, we don't know that. So, all right, Lee, the floor is open to your questions.
Hi,
And, yeah, please speak into the mic.
I would like to go back to the national security and domestic security implications of this signal breach. On the domestic side, if none of that conversation was actually classified and the Trump administration doesn't care about it, then why do they care to keep secret the flight information for the Venezuelans who were kicked out? On the foreign policy national security side, what precedent does this set, and how are other countries going to view the trustworthiness of our national security infrastructure? I don't know if precedent actually even applies, if there's enough consistency from day to day or hour to hour in the Trump administration about whether they consider something, well, this is national security secret, but tomorrow it's not going to be a national security secret. So are we really going to be, are we now in a situation where both domestically and from outside, people aren't going to trust us and we're not going to be able to get information that we need because nobody will see it as safe to share us with and share any important information with us?
On the domestic side, look, tremendous hypocrisy, which is in our future for the next several years. It's transactional. If it's secret and they want it to be secret, it is. If it's not, they don't like it, it's not. On the international side, we've already seen a UK official come out publicly and say, we can't trust the security of our UK classified information with the Trump administration. That's an astounding statement to come from an ally. I can tell you the degree to which we rely on the Five Eyes countries, particularly the UK, every day to keep our country safe, would really astound many people. We can't do it alone, and now we have a government official in the UK saying, we can't share everything with you.
This is very critical because keeping journalists safe abroad depends on our diplomatic relationships, and those are badly frayed with regard to our traditional allies. Right? We have another question.
Hi. To start, I'd like to thank you all for what you have done and are advocating here today. Second, I'd like to know what, if anything, we could all do to help you continue to keep the news free and open and protect you from the threats that you are facing.
I'd love to comment on that. That's okay, Claire. The most important thing, subscribe.
Yes.
Subscribe. And also, to local papers, to small papers, small outlets. I mean, accountability journalism really begins at the local level, and it's been decimated. And, we cannot have a robust media without financial support of readers. So that, to me, is the number one thing.
Yeah, I'll use the opportunity to give a little commercial here. So I'm the founding chair of the Lenfest Institute for Journalism that owns the Philadelphia Inquirer. And think what you want about the Inquirer, and I know people like to complain about this or that, but we are so fortunate here in Philadelphia to have a news organization that is owned by a nonprofit that still has a robust newsroom of about 200 people. The San Jose Mercury News, which I would argue may be the most important power center of the world in Silicon Valley, they had at their peak about 650 journalists. They now have 30, I believe, in their newsroom. Here in Philadelphia, again, it's not perfect, but we are really, really fortunate, and I urge you, if you don't subscribe to the Inquirer digitally or in print or both, please do. And supporting local news is every bit as important as supporting robust national news. I think on a national level, as we've seen, people are very much, the best quote I've heard on that is, Americans use the media the way a drunk uses a lamppost, for support, not illumination. So people get their news from Fox, or they get it from Frank and MSNBC. But on a local level, people are not nearly as tribal when it comes to news and issues, a sewer issue, a zoning issue. And I think that's where democracy really needs to be cemented and take a strong hold.
So we have 2 mics, so if you want to get in the queue, please raise your hand. We'll get 2 mics going at once so that we can keep the questions going. So please.
You mentioned a bit about taxing journalists through libel cases, possible criminal cases. Could you discuss who's going to defend the journalists given what's happened to those?
Yeah. Josh, why don't you take that one?
Sure. I think the first thing that's going to happen with journalists, as we were mentioning this James Risen case earlier, is less likely that the administration will directly try to charge or arrest them, but it's more an effort to go at their sources. And that was where Jim Risen faced this challenge, which was they were demanding that he testify basically about who his source was for a particular story or account that he had published, and he didn't want to do that, and it became quite a showdown. Look, I think there will always be some lawyers that are willing to defend journalists, but I think what this gentleman's alluding to is the fact that we've seen these attacks on, I think, 4 major law firms so far by the Trump White House with executive orders trying either to put them out of business or dramatically diminish their business. Some of the orders went so far as to say that they were going to prevent their lawyers from going into federal buildings. One of them has been blocked by a federal judge. We're seeing sort of a weird collective action problem, similar to the one we talked about with the press corps in the press room, where, collectively it might be in all the firms' interest to resist this, since it does seem like Trump is going to come for one after another. But at any given moment, it seems like the firms are deciding many of the firms are deciding it's not in their direct interest to come to the defense of their colleagues. So I think there is definitely a crisis going on at the law firms, and we will probably see in the next week or so whether they decide to switch to try to put up some kind of united front against this, or whether the administration is going to succeed in picking them off one by one. That said, like I said, you don't have to be represented by one of these global law firms in order to have very good representation. So while it's a worrisome trend, I don't think it means that journalists are going to go unrepresented. And I have some friends, and David has some friends that I'm confident would represent us regardless of what it took. And I will say there are also lawyers that have disaffiliated from their firms in order to take on clients that they wanted to take on, including President Trump, which makes it particularly odd that they are mounting this campaign to try to intimidate law firms. They may see it as just desserts, but I think a lot of people in the legal community, including conservatives in the legal community, find it rather disturbing because they've spent the last several years complaining about lawyers being kicked out of their firms for taking unpopular cases.
It bears repetition what you just said. In effect, there is nobody who has depended more on lawyers willing to represent unpopular political candidates and political figures than Donald Trump. So you would think that this idea of politicizing lawyers who represent, who get involved in politics and represent political candidates would not work to his interest.
I did just want to add, too, the Reporters Committee for the Freedom of the Press. I used to work there. I know a couple people are on the board here. They do a lot of really important work for journalists who are under attack. So one of the questions was, how can you help? One would be to provide funding for this nonprofit organization that does really important work for journalists around the nation.
Reporterscommittee.org.
Next question.
I think I have the next question. Actually, I have an observation. Catherine, you mentioned, you joked about the portrait. They should check it, and Frank's probably familiar, but in 1945, there was a group of Soviet children that gave the Great Seal to the ambassador in Moscow, and it sat there for 7 years. It was a listening device. That's kind of interesting. But my question, I guess, sort of Jeffrey Goldberg and his counsel at Atlantic was quite courageous, because that was obviously classified material. And I wonder what you think about, what the deliberations they went through to then publish unilaterally the first report, and then of course they said, well, it wasn't classified, and then they had the courage to report the tweets, and I'm surprised that the administration hasn't hinted or gone after them for like espionage or violating the Espionage Act. And it seems, thank God they're sort of protected by the First Amendment, but, that was a risky move.
It's absolutely a risky move, and I would say the news cycle today is not over yet. So anything could happen, and I frankly would not be surprised if we did see some effort by the administration to bring some.
Yeah, the record sort of hinted that maybe Goldberg got on the signal, something which they sort of hinted at that.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Next question here. And let's keep the mic going. We'll have a few more minutes of questions and then open up for our reception.
So with the stories about the IRS and ICE possibly cooperating with the exchange of illegal immigration or illegal immigrant information so that ICE can perform raids, and then the whole signal breach on top of that, do you guys foresee like increased enforcement on communication, preventing information about the administration being written about, or do you like?
In what form exactly? Increased restrictions on writing about the administration in what way?
I meant like increased enforcement of like actually confidential communication routes as opposed to signal or any other kind of communication methods utilized. Does that make sense? Or did I just worried everything?
I'm just going to try to clarify the question, which is that if they're classified communications, they're not supposed to be shared with reporters to begin with. And so if you're talking about only unclassified information should be shared, and even then, I think most members of most departments would be told not to talk to reporters, right?
I think what the question may be, though, is whether there could be an effort to shut down secure communications completely. So we have seen that in the past, going back for a decade or so, or longer, really, probably there was this fight over Kalia, which is now like 25 years ago or something like that. So we've seen efforts from time to time by the US government to install what critics would say is a backdoor into any type of encryption application. And they've tried to do that, to get legislation to do that. It was, I think, Jim Comey's phrase that he used for it was lawful access, but the people that didn't like it called it a backdoor, because it does require basically allowing a breach in the encryption so that somebody that has the correct keys can go in. My sense is it failed so far for a number of reasons. One is this encryption technology has become ubiquitous and has also become very valuable in places that are police states for people that are dissidents to communicate. So to set a precedent where the government will mandate that there be some kind of backdoor that they can open is obviously the same kind of technology that would be used by many, many other countries. I also just think there may be some practical difficulties with doing that, although you can certainly see things, if you want to look at it this way, like the TikTok ban that was passed
about to mention that.
as an effort by the government to say, you can't have that app on your phone. And you couple it with Apple's walled garden that says that you can't have an app on your phone at all unless it comes from the Apple App Store. And now you have the government and Apple telling you together that you can't use secure communications, which is a little weird since Apple's brand is secure communications. But I think that is definitely something that we have to be concerned about, but it isn't something that legislatively progressed very far up to this point. And a lot of people are now using Signal and other encrypted apps.
Right.
So, I think it would still be an uphill battle.
But let's notice the contradictions here, because while the DOD may be investigating leakers within the department, some of which may be coming from their own senior leadership, the White House is fighting to try to keep TikTok available. And TikTok is, a bipartisan Congress passed legislation finding that TikTok was an enormous security risk because the Chinese use it to spy on the United States. So, this is This is an administration that is happy to expose the American public to enormous security risks at the same time, and to leak classified information on common messaging apps at the same time that they may really be prosecuting people and engaging in other sorts of threats to, against journalists and other individuals for leaking classified information. So we may have a lot of contradictions there. All right, well, I think we're going to leave it there. While we're talking about donations, let me just say that the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law has to raise all of its own funds. We are not directly supported by the university, other than the fact that we benefit from being physically present in the university. Like all other charitable organizations, we are part of the university's 501c3, therefore your donations are tax deductible. We are very, very grateful for any support that you care to give us, especially in these difficult times as we are fighting to defend the rule of law. We'll continue fighting to defend the rule of law. Therefore, if you are interested in making a tax-deductible donation to CERL, please see Jen Cohen right over here, who is our Director of Engagement. We take checks, pennies, credit cards, pledges, and handshakes and hugs. Please give a warm thanks to our excellent panelists. Thank you so much for joining us. And please join us for a glass of wine and some nibbles over here on the side of the room. Thanks so much.
Sure, that's good. Your timing is impeccable as always.